putting a dip in your hip, a glide in your stride. Welcome to the mothership, the home of the travelers of the universe, with shows throughout the week. Everything you want, everything you could need. From the paranormal to the supernatural, from the spiritual to the unknown, from emotions to comedy. You can find us at Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and so much more. This is R.I.F.T Nation Network, the RNN. And now, your featured show. Shall we begin?
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Taboo Topics with Jean Broida and Stan Murray. We have an important announcement before we get going here. This is our sensitive and offensive content disclaimer from the R.I.F.T Nation Network. Please note that this podcast may contain material that some listeners may find sensitive, offensive, or disturbing. We strive to create respectful and informative content, but topics discussed may include mature themes such as violence, explicit language, or controversial subjects, triggering content, including discussions related to mental health, trauma, or other sensitive issues, explicit language. Occasionally, our guests or hosts may use strong language. While we aim to handle these topics with care and empathy, we encourage listeners to exercise discretion. If you find any content distressing, consider skipping or seeking support. Remember that this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice. If you need assistance, please consult a qualified expert. And with that said, welcome to the show. Good evening, everyone. Stan, how are you?
I'm doing great. It was a beautiful day here today, and I got to enjoy it. So when that happens, that's a good thing for me.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. Welcome, everyone, to Taboo Topics with Jean Broida and Stan Murray. It's Monday night, April 15th, 2024. Tax day. I hate to say it, but it's over now, actually. Well, not necessarily. People have until midnight, I believe, to get a postmark, if that's your thing, to have a filing. I'm excited about our topic tonight, Stan. How about you?
I am. This is one of the first, I remember, I'll get into that later, but this is really the first one that I remember being broadcast on TV, hearing about it, and I was mesmerized after that. So this is one of them things that fuels the fire.
Well, here it is, Betty and Barney Hill. It's the first widely publicized UFO case in American history. Its landmark It's awesome. It's epic. It's long. It's involved, and it's creepy. So let's get into it. What do you say?
Let's go.
All right, let's go. I'm gonna make this thing big, and we'll be small. Oh, you can't even see us, but I hope you can hear us. We are checking the chat. We got it together. If you're out there and you want to shout us out, please do so. If you have a burning question, please do so. We welcome all discussion and discourse. Tonight's topic, the very taboo Betty and Barney Hill UFO abduction, happened in 1961, but didn't get into public view until 1965, when the story was actually leaked by a newspaper in Europe, and it hit the New York City newswires first in the United States. But let's not jump ahead of the game. The story starts the evening of September 19th, 1961. Now, I know I understand that probably the majority, well, maybe not the majority, I shouldn't say that. Many of our listeners do not remember 1961. Stan, do you remember 1961 at all?
I do somewhat. Yes, I was about my last year before I started grade school. But I do remember some of it. I kind of remembered, I want to say, not exactly the tension that was on the news. You know, you had the Cold War. That shortly after that, you know, Kennedy's assassination, the Cuban Missile Crisis. All these things were occurring in the
Well,
early
those hadn't
60s.
happened yet. Those had
It
not
hadn't happened.
happened
I
yet.
had them.
Those
But
hadn't
like I
happened
said,
yet.
I can, in my mind, they got pushed together. But like I said, it was
And
a very interesting time.
let's welcome Susan and Renee. Hey, you made it. You're just in time. We're just getting underway. We're talking about the landmark case of Betty and Barney Hill, abducted by ETs overnight, September 19th and 20th, 1961. Okay, quiz time. Stan,
Okay.
this is tough. Do you happen to know Billboard's album of the year for 1961?
Hmm.
This is hard.
Album of the year.
Yeah, album of the year. What was the big movie in 1961, basically? It's tough. This is tough. But when you hear it, you're going to go, of course it was. Because we're that old.
Around the World in 80 Days?
Oh, so close. Sound of Music.
Oh.
Julie
Okay.
Andrews. Yeah, we're that old. Okay, so we've dated ourselves. That's fine. Here's Betty and Barney Hill. Meet Betty and Barney Hill. An average American couple, except for one thing, they're interracial, which back in 1961 was unusual. But they pulled it off. They were very middle class by any standard. She was a social worker, and he worked for the post office. They lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is on the coast, Portsmouth, mouth of the port. And he would drive at midnight to Boston to work the overnight shift at the post office. So I just found out they were fairly recently married when they got the idea from Betty's sister's daughter. In other words, Betty Hill's niece, Kathleen Marden, had just gotten married, or at least had just taken a trip with her husband to Niagara Falls. And she said, you got to go to Niagara Falls. So Barney asked Betty, have you ever been there? And she said, no, I haven't. So unbeknownst to Betty, Barney booked a trip for them, arranged a trip to drive up from Portsmouth to Montreal and see Niagara Falls from the Canada side. And so they came from Canada. They were going to overnight it. They left in what they thought to be, they'd calculated how much time it would take to get home to Portsmouth. And they were driving overnight. Their plan was to arrive in Portsmouth at 2 a.m. before going to work that basically same day, right? Mm-hmm. But they wanted to catch a few hours of sleep, compose themselves, just get a little rest and then go into work. But it didn't shake down that way. As we will soon see. A little about me before we get too far into way, but not too much about me. I assume you can read, and I welcome you to read the screen. I've been looking into UFOs for quite a long time, decades and decades and decades, since teenagehood, basically. And it grabs me along with crop circles much more than other equally valid paranormal topics like cryptoids or ghosts. But this is my thing. And I love to talk about it. I do psychic things, mystic things, read tarot, do astrology, but not tonight. Tonight, we're putting on our UFO hats, our tinfoil hats. This case is so important that I put it in chapter 5 of my Amazon book, Unknown Objects, which is the 1950s term for UFOs, unknown objects. And that is the top 10 U.S. UFO cases. Well, chapter 5. So halfway through this book, basically, here come Betty and Barney Hill. As I said, Betty and Barney Hill abduction, when it came out in 1965, was the first widely publicized and shocking UFO abduction story. The Hills set out with their family dog, Delcy. And before we get too much further, I'm going to shout out some other people. We got Keith. Hey, Keith. Welcome, welcome. All right, let's keep going. So the Hills had taken their vacay, excuse me, with their family dachshund, Delcy. So cute. And Delcy has an important part to play in this story. And they set out in Barney's 1957 Chevy Bel Air. What a classic, epic. This is what people drove back then. So he's driving a 4-year-old car in 1961 up to Montreal to see Niagara Falls with Betty and tool back home, back in time to work Monday morning in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That's the plan, but things didn't go to plan. Because right around 10:15 p.m., 10:30 p.m., somewhere around there, Betty noticed a luminous object, a light in the sky as she was looking out the window. He's driving. She's looking out the window. The moon is out. She can see the moon. She can see Jupiter, which is quite bright. But this object is below them and then rises up to their altitude. So it's not a falling star. It's not a shooting star. It's not something that is acting like gravity is affecting it. Okay. So she's like, that's interesting. By the way, the map here is showing you Montreal is up here in the upper left. And the red line shows the path of their journey down New Hampshire State Route 3. This is before there was a super highway, before an interstate highway. And this is their actual route. Okay. So the arrowhead here is basically where things started to get, where our story begins. And the green shading here represents the White Mountains of New Hampshire. This is a very famous resort area with hiking. Even I have been there. And it's beautiful and gorgeous. And the road cuts through part of this forest. And so, as you would imagine, at around 10:30 at night, there was a little bit of car traffic, but not a lot, by Betty and Barney's account at least. And it was romantic in the sense that it was dark. There probably weren't a lot of street lights, and the road would be fairly dark. There would be some light, and the moon was out. It wasn't pitch black or anything, but well, just wait, just hear me out. This is the route they took, and Portsmouth is down here in the lower right. That's their goal. That's their target. It's like a video game. They started here in the upper left. They're trying to get to the lower right, but something happened. Something weird. They had some high strangeness on the way home, shall we say. Here we go. So Betty's watching this light, and it's not behaving like a shooting star. So she says, Barney, there's something out there, and it's not like a shooting star. He says, well, it's probably an airplane. Now, Barney had been in the Army during World War II, infantry. So he was familiar with a lot of aircraft, which were new in the day, by the way. So he said, it's probably, it has to be an aircraft, right? An aircraft or a satellite. Those were the two choices. And there weren't many satellites either. He says it's an aircraft or satellite. And Betty's going, well, it doesn't really look like a satellite, but I'm not sure. Why don't we pull over? Delsey's got to take a little walk. We walk the dog, and we got binoculars in the glove compartment. Let's take a look. So that's what they do. He pulls over at a picnic area. And as he takes Delsey out of the back seat, for some reason he can't really explain to himself, he goes back to the trunk of his car and he unlocks it and he pulls out his service revolver, which he keeps back there, and he tucks it into his pants, into the front of his pants. And Betty, meanwhile, has gotten the binoculars out. She's looking up at this light and she sees it's more than a light. It's an object. So he's like, Betty, give me the binoculars. You know how people are. Betty, it's my turn to look through the binoculars. So he's looking and he's seeing the same thing. He's saying it's more than just a luminous object. It's a physical object that is luminous. Okay, so that's rather a distinction. If you get down to UFO research, that's quite a distinction. So he's not liking this at all. The military man in him is thinking, I'm not liking this at all. So they get in the car and they drive further south and they enter what's known as the Franconia Notch. And that's where this rock formation is that's on the screen now, the Old Man in Cannon Mountain, or at least it was, because it has since 1961 eroded. It's not there anymore. It fell off the face of the mountain. It fell off, right, Stan?
Yes. Yes. Probably about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe it fell off.
It fell off.
Time caught up with it.
But the circle there is showing where Betty says she saw a UFO. It was hovering in the sense that it wasn't traveling from point A to point B, but it didn't just stand still. It was jerking around. It would go up and down and sideways. It was herky-jerky. She thought, well, that's kind of weird. And she said it was 1.5 times the length of this rock profile. And that rock profile, if you can see it there, facing where the UFO would be, as it were, that's 40 feet long. So 1.5 times that is 60 feet long. So estimated length or diameter of this UFO, which was pancake shaped, was about 60 feet by Betty's estimation. Okay, so we can take that with a little grain of salt, but that's non-trivial. I'm 5 feet tall, so 10 times of me. If you stack 10 of me on top of me, then you would have 50 feet. So they're looking at it. And by the way, it was not daylight. It was dark with stars and moon and Jupiter. So this is just showing what the rock face looked like and where the UFO was in relationship to it. So that's where they were looking at it first through the binoculars. And it was pretty far away. But as they were looking at it, it came closer and toward them. And Barney didn't like that at all. He especially didn't like that at all. Betty had been calling out to this thing. She had her window rolled down. She's like, yoo-hoo. This is by her own account. Yoo-hoo, come on over. Her sister had seen a UFO and she was interested in the topic, although they both said they'd never watched any shows on UFOs. They knew nothing about UFOs. But when Betty started talking up UFO, Barney was like, don't even talk that story. Don't even talk about that. I don't even want to hear that. Barney was already clenching. His sphincter was already clenching when Betty was teasing him and saying, come on over. And then it came on over. And that's when things got even weirder. So Barney now was freaked out. He's starting to really freak out. He gets in the car. They get Delsey back in the car and they get in. Got the binoculars handy. He's got the gun in his belt and he's driving south on Route 3, New Hampshire. But he's not going fast. They're watching this UFO. and it's tracking them now, which, you know, if you're in a car late at night, after 10:30 at night, nobody else much around, this is probably not the thing you want to have happening to you. So it's starting to creep them out. And Betty says, or between the two of them, I should say, they decide, let's pull over for a closer look. And they get to a familiar landmark, Indian Head Resort, with teepees. They had, back in the day, before it was politically incorrect, there would be resort constructs that were teepees to advertise people to come in. And they saw some sort of teepee associated with the Indian Head Resort. They went, oh, we've been there before. We're in familiar territory. We feel safer. And when they passed that landmark, all of a sudden this UFO came in close. It came in close, and it came in over the car, and it stopped ahead of the car. And Barney slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road. So there was not much traffic around. He just slammed on the brakes, and basically looking at this thing, and he realizes that stopping in the middle of the highway is not necessarily the best thing. He's freaked out, but he has the presence of mind to, and the light too, also, it, from the middle of the road, it drifts off over some woods. So he goes down a little side road, and he pulls over a little bit. He's not on the highway anymore. Gets out with the binoculars. Betty's still in the car, and he gets out and he takes a look. And this is an artist's depiction of what he saw through binoculars at the second stop, which was basically a roadside pull-off. I mean, not an official pull-off. He pulled over to see what up. This light was hovering, not a light. This craft was buzzing him now. You know, it's like over them, and he has to get out and look. Now he can see beings behind windows on half of the craft. The craft had been rotating, and so when the panoramic windows rotated around to the back, you couldn't see the light source anymore, and so it was like the whole thing blinked off. So they had this blinking effect before it got close. And when it got close like this, it stopped rotating, and the windows faced Barney. And all these beings were looking down at him. Some 10 beings were looking down at him from this big array of windows. They were backlighted, and they were all dressed the same. They had shiny black uniforms on, and they had matching hats. He couldn't tell what kind of hats they were, but there was one of them off to the side, which creeped him out especially. Here's Barney's actual drawing later of what he saw. So after some time, time is not relevant here. Barney saw these beings. Then all of them except one turned around, and they began working at a quick pace at a panel of lights behind them. And one of them off to the left, who kept looking at Barney. We find out later this one is the leader of the rest. The leader is looking down at Barney. He's got a scarf, and Barney thinks at first this guy's a friendly. Now he's thinking in military terms. Is he friend or foe? And he thinks, this guy's smiling at me. He looks friendly. And then he looked closer, and he thought, even though he's smiling, he looks mean. He looks like a Nazi. That's what Barney thought. He had lived through World War II. He was in combat. And he thought, this guy looks like an evil Nazi who's grinning at me. And then Barney began to hear in his mind, don't worry. We're not going to hurt you. Just stand still. Don't move. Just stand still. Don't move. We're not going to hurt you. And it was hypnotic. It went over and over in his mind. And Barney was riveted to the spot. He couldn't move. And he realized, I say the same thing to rabbits when I'm hunting them. Don't worry, little guy. I'm not going to hurt you. Boom. And he said, we're about to be trapped. And he tore himself away from looking at this being in the craft. He had to tear himself away. There was a mind meld going on. Some kind of mind control was going on at this point with Barney. So he successfully tore himself away and he raced back to the car. And he got in and he said, Betty, 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 we got to leave right now. And he gunned the car. And she was looking out the window to see where the UFO was. He was convinced it was still there. She couldn't see anything, but she couldn't even see the stars, suggesting perhaps that the UFO was directly overhead and just so enormous that they couldn't see the stars. And Barney is flipped out. He's driving. They hear a drumming sound on the trunk of the car, and they feel from this drumming a resonance through the whole car and a tingling. And they described it later as if a tuning fork had hit the car. Tuning forks had hit the car. And if you've ever struck a tuning fork and listened to it, it vibrates, and it vibrates for quite a long time. And if this thing was being pelted with something, some energy or some substance that was causing the car to vibrate and ping like a tuning fork, that's what they described. And the next thing they knew, so they heard this sound, they felt the sensation, and the next thing they knew, they had lost 2 hours of time and they were 35 miles further south than they thought they were. And this is their route. First, Betty saw this odd light and they stopped at the picnic area, took the dog out. Barney gets his gun. At number 2 in the Franconia Notch, he's stopped and they're taking the closer look. It's following them. And then at number 3 around Lincoln, that's where Barney gets out, takes the closer look with the binoculars, freaks out, continues down the highway, he thinks, and then they come to 15 miles south, and they're not where they should be at the right time. They are where they should be, but they have lost 2 hours of time. In other words, instead of getting home at 2 a.m. to be able to get to work after a few hours sleep, they roll in at 5 a.m, and they can't explain why. And not only that, there's all this compelling physical evidence. Both of their wristwatches had stopped. Barney's new dress shoes, newish dress, his best dress shoes is how they were described. His best dress shoes were so scuffed, especially on the toes, that he never wore them again. By the way, that's not his shoe. and that's not their watch. But that is Betty's dress. That purple dress is actually Betty's dress, which when she got home was torn. The lining inside this dress was torn from the waist to the hem, and the zipper was torn on the back. And she noticed it had a little stain or residue on it. She put it in a closet for 20 years. And after 20 years, she kind of remembered it. It's weird. She pulled it out. It's strange. I don't fully understand this part of it, but she had it lab tested, and it's been lab tested as recently as 2021, 2020. And they're finding strangeness, very high strangeness, that the substance on the dress is inexplicable, basically inexplicable for their environment, what happened to them. So that's a story for another day. Let's carry on. The binocular strap of Barney's binoculars was severed as if cut, not ripped or torn. It just was cut as if by a knife. And remember, he'd been holding these binoculars to his eyes and was saying when the leader was beaming him, don't move, don't move. He's like, I gotta move, I can't move. Something's keeping me from moving. He had to use extreme force of will to get those binoculars away from his eyes. And as soon as he did, it like broke the spell. It broke the hypnotic thing that was going on, or the mind control thing. At least it reduced it. And he was able to get back to the car, and they sped off. And then there were the lingering described as oily spots on the car trunk. This is not, in fact, what they looked like. I needed a photo, so I found one. But I did see a drawing that Betty made. And these were basically, now it was a drawing, it was 2D, but they weren't 3-dimensional. They were spots that wouldn't wash off. So in that sense, oily, you know what I'm saying? And then people brought a compass toward it. They were experimenting with this stuff. Like, what could it be? Somebody had the idea, let's bring a compass nearby. And so it deflected near these spots, and they would take it away from that area and move it around other parts of the car. No deflection. And when they got it to the trunk, deflection. So it was a very weird thing. It was a weird thing. And they thought, well, these are weird things, but they had to go to work. And so they went to work and they kind of forgot about it until about a week later. Betty had 5 dreams, 5 nights in a row. And they basically told the story of what had happened to them, but with some screen memories. For example, instead of ETs, or instead of a leader ET, she remembered a friendly police officer with a hat. Okay, so that's a classic example of a screen memory. So they got home, they went to work. Betty was very close with her sister who lived across the street. Her sister had seen a UFO, and her sister said, hey, you should tell somebody. And her sister's husband said, her sister's husband was friends with policemen in the area and said, Portsmouth police and other police in New Hampshire and the Northeast area have been contacted by Air Force bases to report any UFOs, which is rather remarkable if you think about it in retrospect. In 1961, Air Forces contact police department and said, oh, by the way, if last night anybody happened to see a UFO, hey, let us know, okay? Thanks. So Betty reached out to Pease Air Force Base, which is not far from Portsmouth. It's the closest Air Force base. She filed a report, but she left out the ET part. She thought, they will think we're crazy if I mention anything about beings, other beings. But she described the craft in the sky and its erratic behavior and how it darted around, and that it wasn't the moon and it wasn't Jupiter. And the report made it into Project Blue Book. That's pretty incredible. But it was marked unresolved due to basically lack of evidence. It's hard to, I don't know what lack of evidence there was, but it was deemed inconclusive. So that's all very interesting. Pease Air Force did confirm unidentified lights or objects at the time of this event, and other people also reported UFOs at the time of this event in that area. So despite all that sort of evidence at the time, early 1960s, complete denial by the Air Force that anything's going on, nothing to see here. Well, both Betty and Barney, they kept their secret, and Betty stopped having dreams after the 5th one, but they had other physical symptoms, especially Barney. Barney just wasn't feeling well, and he developed stomach ulcers. He was really uptight, and it's easy to say now in hindsight, he had post-traumatic stress syndrome from this abduction experience. While it happened, he blanked it out in his mind as best he could. He kept his eyes closed, and he had a monotone going. This all came out under this hypnosis, medical hypnosis. And he thought, if I just keep my eyes closed, it'll be over. And if I keep my eyes closed, it'll be over. Betty, on the other hand, had roused herself. This is interesting. Betty, as they're being led to the craft, Betty had roused herself and said, I want to be aware of what's going on. I want to be conscious, which was a significant difference. And so Betty had much more to tell about her experience than Barney did, who basically played possum during the whole thing and let them do whatever they did. So after they got home, Barney had vague recollections of somebody had collected semen. What? And then he got genital warts. And he got other symptomologies, which were very unsettling, one would think. And Betty was not, well, she was concerned about Barney, of course, but she just felt they'd been touched. That's something that she said, we've been touched. And after the event, they felt tainted. Tainted was the word, dirty. They didn't feel good. And so after months of talking to church people, seeing medical doctors, they finally got hooked up with this Dr. Benjamin Simon, renowned therapist, psychotherapist in the Boston area. And he was doing medical hypnosis, which is not stage hypnosis by any means. It had been used after World War II to treat shell-shocked soldiers. And so there had been already plenty of case histories where medical hypnosis really relieved a lot of stress from a traumatic episode. And so, unlike this picture suggests, Dr. Simon conducted the sessions with the two in separate rooms. He didn't put them under together like this shows. He conducted their sessions separately. And that's good for science because you want to see if they're telling the same story, and they did. So that was sort of a first proof that they hadn't, like one of them had one hypothesis that one of the psychologists along the way had presented to Barney and Betty was that Betty had had these 5 dreams and told Barney about them, and that somehow it's so silly. Somehow he had believed her dreams and they were sharing a psychosis or something. I don't even understand how mainstream psychology covered this up, but they did. They couldn't believe the UFO was, they dismissed UFO. Mainstream psychologists dismissed, even the physical doctors dismissed, all of them dismissed. Even Dr. Benjamin Simon dismissed. Dr. Simon's interrogations during the hypnotic sessions, and I know this because one of them, at least when I was first doing research on this, was on YouTube. Barney's first hypnosis session was available free of charge on YouTube. And Dr. Simon is asking Barney questions to lead him away from what really happened, to lead him away from the truth, Barney's truth. And every time Barney brings the doctor back to what really happened, like, no, that's not what it was. It was like this. And Dr. Simon is very puzzled because he's never encountered anything like this. It's out of this world. And I don't think he ever really became a believer, if you will, despite all of the evidence. He didn't regard it as evidence. They thought there's some psychological mechanism at play here we just don't fully understand. In other words, any mainstream explanation is better than the actual truth, which could well be these two were abducted by a UFO. So here's what they recounted independently under hypnosis with Dr. Simon. They reported that after they heard the drumming sound, Barney pulled off on a forestry road. And when he pulled off the main highway, there were trees on either side of this forestry road. And at the end of this tunnel, basically of trees, they saw an orange light at ground level. It was rather large and it was glowing orange. And in Betty's dream, she had interpreted that as a roadblock. And under hypnosis, Barney said, when he saw this orange light, he said, "Has there been an accident? I think there's been an accident. There's an orange warning light ahead." I thought it was a warning light, orange. And then he said, "There's people blocking the road and I have to stop the car. I'm going to stop the car. There's people in the road. There's an orange light ahead. Has there been an accident? Is something wrong?" And then they both report independently that these beings approaching their car split apart, and half of them basically went to Barney's side and opened his car door, and half of them went to Betty's side of the car and opened her car door and floated them out of the car. They weren't on solid ground. They were being floated. Now, Barney just went limp. And these beings were they were dragging him, and that's when his shoes got scuffed on gravel. This road, forestry road, was gravel. The craft was parked just off to the side of the road, and they were being taken toward a ramp and up and into the craft. And Betty was first. So Betty gets up the top of the ramp, and she's fairly conscious. She's much more conscious. Her eyes are open. She wants to see what's going on. Barney's in complete denial already from the get-go. Complete shutdown. I don't want to know. It can't be happening. Make it stop. And he's being told, you won't be hurt. You won't be hurt. You won't be hurt. So she's up on top of the ramp, and she's looking inside this craft, and she's going, have you ever been on a horse stand where it refused to take a jump, something like that? It's crazy. It's just crazy. So that's what happened. She refused. She refused to go in, and she said that she punched one of the aliens. She punched him in the nose or face, and there was a scuffle, and that's when the lining of her dress tore. That's what she said. Well, they got her inside. They assured her, we're not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt you. We're not going to hurt you. Got her inside. And then they split them up. They put Betty in one examining room and Barney in another one. Barney's like, he's lying on his back. Like, he feels something going down in his private parts. He's like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. I don't want to know. Make it stop. Make it stop. I'll be, they're like, just chill, dude, and we'll put you back in your car. We aren't going to hurt you. We want to do some tests, and then we'll put you back in the car. And that's basically what happened. But Barney's freaking out. He's totally shut down. Betty, on the other hand, is relatively alert and observant. And according to her, they were very curious about how a human body operates in the sense of how the joints work, how our joints work. And so they were manipulating her body and making it move. And sometimes they tried to make it move in ways, try to bend a joint backwards, make the body move in a way it's not supposed to move. So they knew some things. They knew how to collect sperm, but they were unsure about how a human body works in the sense of how all the parts go together and what directions they go. They had discovered in Barney's room that he had dentures from the war. Barney had been close enough to a grenade explosion. It had blown out all his teeth, and he had complete dentures, upper, lower. So during his exam, they tugged his teeth and they came out. So they're like, oh, okay. So they went right into Betty's room and started tugging on her teeth, and they didn't come out. And she's like, hey, what are you doing? I'm like, well, why don't your teeth come out? His teeth came out. She said, let me explain. And they figured that out. But can you imagine what would happen if they saw a guy with a wig or a woman with a wig or a toupee? Let's just keep the gender out of it. Wig or a toupee. I'm sure they encounter that sooner or later. Well, in Betty's case, the leader is sort of behind her head. She's lying on her back, and there's a being who's doing the exam. And this being pulls out the largest hypodermic, or largest needle, not hypodermic, the largest needle, medical needle that she's ever seen in her life. And this being says, don't worry, I'm going to insert this in your navel. This won't hurt a bit. She's like, oh, this is going to hurt a lot. Don't do that. This is going to hurt like the dickens. And the being's like, no, it won't hurt at all. Sticks this, as soon as the point penetrates her navel, she's screaming. She's screaming, oh, you're hurting me. Oh, and she's crying. She's crying. She's screaming. And the leader behind her comes around and looks at her, and then passes his face in front of her eyes, and she feels no more pain. And they finish the procedure. Well, today we would call that procedure, it's got a big fancy medical name, but basically they're collecting eggs from her, and they had collected sperm from him, milked him of sperm, and they did other physical exams. And then for Betty, because she'd been alert and paying attention, now under hypnosis, she was freaked out. But according to her in her subsequent interviews, when she was fully conscious and remembering what she remembered in a sense, okay, she listened to her own hypnosis tapes and Barney's, so she knew what she had said under hypnosis. But that's different from, I mean, their minds had shut down and blanked it out because it was rather horrific. You know, this whole thing of being with aliens would be rather horrific. And this is what they looked like. They weren't grays. These were not little gray men. These were humans or humanoids, according to them both. They didn't look quite human. they were white, chalky white. You know, they weren't gray. And so after Betty's exam, they weren't done with Barney, apparently. And she's chatting up the leader, so-called. And she says, well, where are you guys from? Which seems a little incredible under the circumstances, but she did. Where are y'all from? So the leader somehow produces the star map, in which we would now call it a hologram. It appeared in the air of the room. It wasn't on a wall. It wasn't on a device. It just appeared. It was there. It hadn't been there, and all of a sudden it's there. It was luminous. And she drew it after hypnotic. She had a post-hypnotic suggestion to draw the star map, and it's on the left here. So what we're seeing here is a couple of stars with other stars out here. And the lines represent trade routes. That's what's being said. It said we go back and forth quite a bit here for trade. We have a route here. We have a route here. We have a route here. And occasionally we go this way. And sometimes we go there and sometimes we go there. But this is basically where we hang out. This is our neighborhood in space. And he turned to Betty and he said, well, now that you've seen where we live, where do you live? Can you show us where you live on this map? And she said, oh, heck no. Heck to the no. I know nothing about astronomy. I know nothing about the solar system or galaxies or stars. I don't know anything about it. And this is interesting to me. The leader was, according to Betty, visibly disappointed, which is a human emotion, by the way. Betty ascribed the human emotion of disappointment to the leader when he found out she didn't know boo about astronomy. He wanted to talk astronomy with her. He wanted to go all Stephen Hawking's on her, but she was no Stephen Hawking's. Well, later, a researcher took it upon herself. Marjorie Fish, I want to say her name is, if she's still alive. She did a bunch of research over several years, and she was looking at computer databases before we had today's search capabilities. She was doing a lot of manual comparison, I think, and doing the kind of computer research one could in the day. But it took her years to find a match to Betty's star map. And this is very controversial, by the way, that this is actually what Betty had seen, that she hadn't been influenced subsequently. We'll never know for sure. But it's an interesting story. It's a great story, that this is actually the Zeta Reticuli system. And you can see an astronomical depiction on the right with the black background. These are the actual planetary placements, and the lines are showing how the routes would have been on, the lines are representing Betty's routes on this modern map, if you will. Okay, technology map. Now, when Betty was on the ship chatting up the leader and they were having a good old time, she said, I want to have a souvenir so people will believe me, because I don't think people are going to believe me. And the leader said, well, what would you like? She said, how about a book? So he opened a closet in this room where she was. I'm doing like this with my hand. I don't know how he opened it. I don't know what kind of mechanism he had, but he opened a closet. And inside this closet, he said, what do you want? And there were goodies in there, gadgets. And so she's like, remember, this is 1961. She's not low tech, she's no tech. Okay, no tech. She's a no tech person. She's looking in there. She's like, she sees something that's a book, and she pulls it out. She says, "I want this book," and it's big. She's holding it while they're talking. Well, as they're about to depart the craft and go back to their car, the leader says, "You got to give the book back." And she's like, she doesn't want to give it back. She says, "You got to give it back. I can't let you have it. Sorry." So the beings escort Betty and Barney back to their car. And when they get to the car, Barney, under hypnosis, says, "And we're back to the car, and everything's all right, and everything's fine, and that wasn't so bad, and now we'll go home." Basically, he's just like, And so that was the point where they start driving, and 35 miles later, basically, or some 30 miles later, he wakes up on he regains consciousness on the highway 35 miles south of where they last knew they were. And they still have quite a bit of a drive to get home. So that was quite unsettling for them. And the hypnosis was some relief to them, but Barney never regained his physical health. He developed stomach ulcers. He had nervous conditions. His subconscious was profoundly disturbed by all of this. They did, however, have to go public in 1965 when the story was leaked. As I said at the very beginning, if you tuned in, hey, welcome to Taboo Topics with Gene Broida and Stan Murray, but it looks like Stan had to drop off. Then he might have a thunderstorm in his area with weak internet. We'll find out later what happened to him, but welcome, welcome, welcome. The Hills didn't quite go on the lecture tour, but they did go on TV a couple times. They were on one of those shows that was like, "I've Got a Secret." And their secret was they'd been abducted by a UFO. I think that's really hilarious. But it wasn't hilarious to them. You can see Betty here is smiling in this picture. Barney, not so much. He's very serious here. He's showing that drawing that we saw that he had made of what he saw through the binoculars and describing how the craft actually changed. Those pointy side fins came out at lower elevation. So they talked about it, but it wasn't helping Barney's health at all. Betty sort of bounced back. They continued working. They didn't want the public to know at all, but after the story leaked 4 years later, they had to talk about it. So they did. And it really set the stage for future experiencers, which is what we now call people who've had close encounters with UFOs, including being taken aboard, that experiencers undergo this. Pretty much this is a prototype or template for other UFO abductions where there's a physical examination and reproductive sampling. We'll do a show on reproductive sampling and what that might mean. And I know a lot of you out there listening already have anticipated where I'm going with this, but we'll leave it for another day. Now, here's where it actually happened. Here's an overhead aerial photograph of off of State Route 3. Barney had pulled off on Route 175. That's that forest road. And then down the side of a side road, basically. And that's where there's a yellow arrow that's pointing where the craft had landed on the ground. And so he had driven in this way. They're seeing this orange light over here. And all of a sudden there's beings in the road, blocking the road and taking them over here. So even though the mainstream still refuses to believe that this actually happened, Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece who lived across the street, lobbied and finally got New Hampshire State to erect a marker, an historical memorial marker about the Betty and Barney Hill incident. And so if you're ever in that area of New Hampshire and you want to go check it out, it's memorialized. Do I think it happened? Yes, I do. Do I think it happened the way Betty and Barney described under hypnosis? Yes, I do. but that's just what I think. What do you think? Finally, before I turn to the audience for any feedback, I want to say rest in peace, Barney Hill. He never did get better, and he died of a stroke, a sudden stroke, very unexpectedly, very sad. Betty lived on much longer. So Barney left the Earth plane 1969, and Betty lived on till 2004. She went onto the UFO circuit. She also started a group of UFO watchers and callers. Remember, she called the UFO, "Hey, come on over. I want to see a UFO," like my sister did. And she organized people to go out into the darkness, the dark areas around Portsmouth, drive out far enough in the city where it's dark. And according to her, she had lifelong contact with these beings, not constant, but periodic. And there were times when they would say, okay, if you want proof that we exist, have your group come out to this certain place and we will appear at a certain time and they can take photographs. And they did that. So there's documentation about that sort of thing, if you want to get into it. Betty Hill did a lot to not really institutionalize talking about UFOs, because that came much, much, much later, if it has come at all. But she was one of the first really vocal experiencers to be unrelenting in her message. UFOs exist. I know they exist. And let's raise consciousness. She was into raising consciousness. Interesting that she didn't serve in the military. She's female. She was the housewife, if you will. And Barney had been military. Barney was freaked out. Barney's response was to get his gun. And by the way, when he was staring through the binoculars, he was thinking, he thought to himself, I could get my gun and shoot at that thing, but I don't think it would do any good. Basically, I could shoot. His instinct was to protect Betty through physical violence. And that is so human. That is so human. High strangeness out in New Hampshire. It's a little mind-boggling. It's a little hard to believe, but that's what I think. Checking the chat. What do we got going on? I got the chat thing going. Hey Keith. The star map looks like a Hydra. It does, Keith. Sure does. Well, that's what I got. This is one of the most fascinating cases in UFO history as far as I'm concerned, at least that we know about. And if it interests you, I welcome you. Whoa, right is left, left is right, in is out, up is down. I invite you to check out my book on Amazon. Oh, sooner or later I'll get this. There we go. Chapter 5 is about Betty and Barney Hill. This book goes from top 10 cases from after World War II with the Foo Fighters up through the Phoenix Lights mass sighting 89. And we can talk all about all of these things and more on Taboo Topics with Jean Broida and the, I'm sorry to say, absent Stan Murray. But I welcome all of you, and I will see you all next week. Keep looking up.